le voy a pedir a uno de los miembros del comité de selección de charlas del Review Board de la ECO que presente la primera Keynote al señor Nico Weissman, por favor.
¿Estamos? Hola, hola, ¿se escucha? Bueno, primero que nada, no preparé nada porque estaba en el pasillo y Leo me dijo, che, ¿podés introducir a Ryan? Así que disculpen antes que nada. Estoy muy contento que tenemos a Ryan hoy. Es la primer keynote que da. Es una persona que estuvo durante los últimos 20 años del desarrollo de la industria. Estuvo hablando con todo el mundo. Unas cosas que dijo Iván antes de que empiece la charla es que es posiblemente la persona que habló con más líderes de la industria en todo este auditorio. Y seguramente nos va a compartir una perspectiva que realmente va a ser única. Por eso es una de las razones por las que cuando lo invitamos a dar la keynote, yo sentí que era como algo bastante único y tenemos esta oportunidad ahora en Ekoparty de vivirlo. Ryan es periodista, es, aunque a él no le guste, un influencer de ciberseguridad. Y como dije antes, moderó paneles de todo, estuvo hablando con CISOs, con investigadores durante los últimos 20 años, vio todo el cambio de la industria en los últimos 20 años, así que nada, estoy súper contento de tenerlo acá, a Ryan, y nada, que dejamos que empiece porque está bastante nervioso.
Come with me, take a selfie. I am sweating, I am nervous, so please bear with me. I have no idea what Nico just said. I assume he said some nice things about me, and I'm hoping that he did. Where's my slides? Back. There we go. I want to start here, because when I get invited, Nico must have explained it. I worked for many, many years as a journalist, so I spend a lot of time going to keynotes at conferences to try to find stories. Whenever I find myself at a keynote, I always wonder, why me? Like, why now? What did I do? My one morning out, and I'm ended up here, my eyes are bleeding and my ears are hurting. Because I'll let you in on a secret, I hate keynotes. Keynotes I find are very, very inane and boring, usually with a guy in a suit. Usually he's representing a company. Usually it's a very, very big company that has already paid for this keynote spot, and he's up here to tell you about the changing face of the world and transformational culture and digital transformation. And at the end of it, my eyes are bleeding, my ears are running. So when Nico invited me to keynote here, not only did I go, why me? I started to wonder, why did Nico hate me so much? Why would you subject me to something that I hate so much? So that was my first reaction. My second reaction was, holy shit, I got to find something to say. And since I don't do keynotes, I honestly have no idea what to say. And Nico and a lot of the old Argentinian folks have been behind me to write a book about security. So I decided that if I was going to delete the keynote, and if I were to write a book, and if I were to come here and share stories with you guys, I would rather just come and talk about my life, talk about the things that I've done, the things that I've seen, and I want to set it up in a way where my introduction to cybersecurity started in 2000 and 2001. There was a warm era underway. There was a lot of anxiety and anguish in the industry. And here we fast forward to 2022, 20 years later, and it feels like we're very much in the same place. So I want to frame some of the things that I've seen over the years and talk a little bit about why we are here, what has happened, and some of the things that will help us move forward. I'm trying to sound like a keynoter, so bear with me again. At the end of this here, we're going to learn a couple of things. The first thing you learn is that I also suck at creating PowerPoint slides. So I apologize in advance. The second thing we learn is that we're all fucked. The internet was a big, giant mistake. We should just go outside, close our laptops, and get some fresh air. That's the dark, dark side of it. On the bright side of it, over the years, there's been a lot of incredible, incredible work led by hackers like you, led by security researchers like you, and led by a lot of folks in this room and a lot of folks in this part of the world who really, really put shoulder to the wheel and was incredibly brave at keeping vendors accountable, driving things forward around responsible disclosure, helping us get to a place where a lot of you folks could be compensated for your security research work and hacking work. And I'm going to warn, I want to spend a little time as an old, grumpy old man and a curmudgeon to warn about some ominous signs down the road that sets us back a little bit, and unless we as a community and we, the people here, try to take back control and take back the power, we're going to end up in some really, really dark places. So with that said, setting the stage for what I want to talk about, my name is Ryan Naraine. I spend my time today podcasting and writing about cybersecurity issues still. I spend, my Twitter handle is there. Follow me if you dare brave. I'm usually just a grumpy old man. Point your phones and subscribe. Don't pretend that this is a big don't pretend that you're all cybersecurity folks who are scared, because you're going to restaurants and you're pointing your QR codes to. Like I said, it's been a long road here for me. I've spent about 20 years deeply embedded in security, working first as a journalist, and then when I realized that journalism didn't pay the bills and I had a small family and I needed to almost double my pay, I switched to the dark side and went to help vendors with communications and business strategy and user education and community engagement for some big global brands around the world. And my thing was always, you have to be transparent, you have to be honest, and you have to communicate openly with the audience. That's the only way to trigger and engender trust in the industry. Over the years, a lot of this talk is going to be spent on the bottom side of this here, the eWeek, ZDNet, CBS, SecurityWeek days, where I spent time as an observer, just watching what was happening in the industry and documenting it. After that, I went on to Kaspersky. I got a really, really good look at APT world and the world of advanced attacks before going to companies like Bishop Fox and Intel. I want to talk a little bit about, I'm a sneakerhead, I'm an avid sneakerhead, so if there are any sneakerheads in the audience, we can ping me afterwards, we can talk about sneakers. And I daydream, like a lot of my friends, about occasional competence in jiu-jitsu. So if you want to talk about jiu-jitsu, we can talk about that here. Over the years, my career has given me, well, let me go back to the start. I'm from Georgetown, Guyana, a small country just north of Argentina, but in South America, English-speaking country in South America. And in 1994, I migrated to the US, and in the late 1990s, I landed my first job as a journalist writing about dot-coms in New York, the whole dot-com ecosystem. The dot-com boom was happening, and there was just about to be this big, massive bust. And I landed there, and the youngest person in the room had to be the guy who wrote about cybersecurity, because no one wanted it. And these worm attacks exploded. So I landed in the very, very early days in the wild west of worms. Dot-com was busting. We were heading into what would soon be 9/11. There was Code Red, Nimda, Sasser, Slammer, were the worm attacks of the day. And the Twitter of the day was full disclosure bug track, where folks were just writing and documenting the issues that they were finding. I want to do a little bit of a sidetrack here and encourage all the folks here. Learn to write. Forget about PowerPoints and learn to write. Everything in your work as you move forward is going to be dependent on your ability to write reports and write things. So just a little side note there. So I started out in the wild west of worms, moved through to the covered, and the other big story. So I want to frame this. See how terrible I am at keynoting? I want to frame this talk in a way where these are all the things, in my career, these are all the things I've seen over the years. The Wild West of worms that gave us the Bill Gates memo that drove conversations around responsible disclosure and Microsoft's attempts to define terms for vulnerability disclosure into the whole no more free bugs, pound to own, let's take back the amount of bugs, take back the thing, that drove an industry that created and drove the bug bounty industry, where hackers got a financial seat at the table as bug bounties became default. The problem with that is it started setting into place some dark patterns that created some big, giant cybersecurity businesses that have now turned around and used bug bounties as bribery and as hush money to keep things on the wraps. And the hardest part of it all is that unlike 2001, there are no hacker community today to hold Microsoft accountable. The majority of this talk is going to be focused on Microsoft because I was a Microsoft beat writer. My job was to cover Microsoft security over the years. So I want to frame this, if I were to write a book around, here are some big chapters of the book that really set us up for where we are today. The people that played an important role in driving all the research and fights that got us through this ecosystem. And then I want to end with a little bit of an ominous feeling that 2022 starts to feel very much like 2000 again. And it feels like these problems are getting harder and harder to fix, and we are allowing vendors and commercial interests and money to control everything. So this has been a bird's eye view to my kind of place in this world. And I want to start with the first chapter. The first chapter in my book starts in 2000, and I caption it Weapons, Anarchy, and Responsible Disclosure. Back in 2000, there was a guy named Scott Culp who worked at the MSRC, the Microsoft Security Response Center. He was a program manager there, and I want to guess he might have had the worst job at the time because I mentioned there was a lot of worm attacks and bug track, O-day drops, and so on. And Scott Culp wrote a memo. And the memo basically decried you guys. Like, when I say you guys, I mean the hackers of the time, the security researchers of the time. The software giant wanted to clamp down on security firms who were releasing blueprints. And one of the things Scott Culp wrote in this essay, which was a seminal essay at the time, is that he started to blame security researchers for everything that was happening, rather than take responsibility for what Microsoft's role is in this platform and ecosystem that could not stand up to scrutiny. The daily bug track full disclosure reports drop these things. So Scott Culp wrote that it's high time the security community stop providing blueprints for building these weapons. Does that sound familiar today? Blueprints for building these weapons. He was talking about worms and viruses at the time. And he said it was high time that computer users insisted that the security community live up to its obligations and protect customers. So you realize, you see the game, right? They're already starting to switch the responsibility onto the security research community. The security research community is here, finding holes and bugs and all kinds of problems in their operating system. And Microsoft this is how the conversation starts. He says, we can and should discuss vulnerabilities, but we should be smart, prudent, and responsible in the way we do it. And this responsible word, I believe, might have been the first time we heard about something called responsible disclosure. So that's the first thing. This was a Microsoft attempting to set the conversation, and set the conversation in a way where it's not our fault, it's those guys' fault. And this memo set in train 10 years of some of the most bitter fights and some of the most anguish-filled incidents in our industry, and to my benefit, gave me some of the greatest stories to write as a journalist. So for me, I want to thank Scott Culp for writing this memo. It really started my career in train. Chapter 2, we move forward a little bit to 2000, and Redmond has, prior to this is before the days of Blue Hat, before the days of Security Conference in the year 2000. Microsoft called up a bunch of who's who of cybersecurity It wasn't even cybersecurity at the time, it was InfoSec. Microsoft called up a who's who of InfoSec and brought them to Redmond for an invite-only SafeNet 2000 summit. This is because they're dealing with worm attacks, they're dealing with distrust in the operating systems at scale that nobody imagines, and they have to take control of this. Big customers are calling. You can't even keep Windows XP up or Windows 2000 up for more than a minute before it goes down. It was really, really bad at the time. In fact, there were some times, how many folks in the audience here were around in 2000, 2001, 2002? Oh, good. So there's a handful of, I know, I see the front benches. There's a handful of you folks who know what I'm talking about. But there was a guy at Microsoft at the time named Dr. Steve Lipner, who was running security at the time. He decided that this responsible disclosure that Scott Culp had just kind of set the stage for, they needed to bring industry partners in to validate and check markets. So we ended up at SafeNet 2000, Policy and Practice in the Internet Age, December 7th and 8th, 2000. A handful of like really, really influential who's who of cybersecurity landed at Redmond, and Dr. Lipner put these folks in a room to workshop the idea of disclosure and responsibility. Because what was happening at the time was, it's really, really hard to put into perspective what the landscape looked like at the time. Today, patches are issued, automatic updates are there, the patches are applied, we kind of move on to the next thing. Back then, there was a 0-day drop, and we were all screwed. And Microsoft was scrambling to ship a patch. They didn't document anything properly. Security researchers who had already reverse engineered the patch would already be publishing proof of concepts, exploit code was everywhere, and Microsoft was on the back foot, really, really on the back foot. And quite frankly, to be honest, it really needed to change. It was too much of a free-for-all. It was too much chaos, and computing could not move forward. Right around the time we were creating HTTPS, we were going to drive innovation around e-commerce. Amazon was created, big giant industries was created on this internet that was so fragile. And we were all running on Microsoft operating systems. And I'm the Microsoft beat reporter who is tracking all these things. So in fairness to Microsoft, we really needed to get control of this whole responsible disclosure conversation. But they tried to do the old okie dokie, right? They brought in a bunch of their friendly companies, put them in a room to do a workshop, and say, let's come up with a consensus on what is good. Is it 30 days? Is it 15 days? Do we have to wait for a patch? Do we not have to wait for a patch? So all these consulting companies with their hacker crews and these who's who, this meeting had John Pescatori from Gartner, Ryan Russell, some of the biggest names at the time. Came in there and they sat in this room and they tried to get consensus, and everyone's backslapping each other and feeling like, okay, we're a team together, these researchers are in the room with Microsoft and we're trying to come up with consensus for this thing. It turned out to be a big, giant, massive PR exercise. It turned out to be just Microsoft purchasing time and purchasing goodwill from security researchers, because a year later, these 5 companies, Internet Security Systems, Foundstone, BindView, Guardant, and AtStake is an interesting one, but at the time, in November the following year, would come out and checkmark and blueprint Microsoft's version of what the responsible disclosure thing would look like. AtStake specifically was an interesting one, because AtStake was one of the vendors who was part of this free-for-all, who were dropping tools and dropping ODs and dropping exploits. But when it came down to it, we in my reporting back in 2000 and over the years, it turns out that Microsoft had used the SafeNet 2000 summit to bring these consulting firms in and coerce them, promise them contracts here, contracts there, for validation of what would become Microsoft's version of responsible disclosure. And Microsoft's version of responsible disclosure was, you report the bug to me, you wait until I patch it, you wait an extra, I believe it was 30 days before you could even discuss it, and proof of concept, any sort of release of proof of concept or exploit code that validated it was irresponsible, completely irresponsible. So this is what the policy that came out of this SafeNet thing was. And the reality at the time was, Security researchers would report the bug to Microsoft and wait, and wait, and wait, and then say, hey, are you guys going to fix this thing? And it's like, oh, yeah, next month. And then they would wait again, and then they would wait again. And these guys were creating their black hat talks. They were doing it for notoriety, for headlines. They were doing their black hat talks. And they would submit and wait and wait. And then we just got freaking tired of waiting. They would drop a bug track post, and then Microsoft would start yelling and screaming, calling me, the journalist, to say, what the hell did those guys do? How dare they be that irresponsible? And I'm the journalist writing stories. The security research community has been irresponsible again, dropping exploit for thing, not knowing that in the background, it took months and months and fights and bitter fights between these researchers and these things. So this was what's going on. Quick question here for the folks in the audience who do security research. How much in 2002 does it sound familiar? Like you report a bug, you wait for the vendor to fix it, you wait, you wait, you wait, and then you have no option. Today, there is no bug track and full disclosure. Today, there's bug bounties. And the bug bounties have emerged to be the bribe factor to really keep these things private. So when I eventually write my book, The SafeNet 2000 Policy and Practice in the Internet Age, the meeting of December 7th, and the use of these companies and these things will become a big chapter, because I feel like this was the first time we realized that it was not an honest effort. It was not a good faith effort on Microsoft's part at coming up with consensus on what vulnerability disclosure looked like. It was bullshit PR, and to this day, I feel misled and I feel used with a lot of the articles I wrote about some of you security research and some of you old school folks in the audience. So for that, you have my apology. Once the SafeNet conference ended and Microsoft came to this consensus on what responsible disclosure is, we fast forward to 2000 and the famous Bill Gates trustworthy computing memo. The trustworthy computing, and now looking back, it really starts to feel like it was like a deliberate thing, right? The Scott Culp memo comes along, sets up the Dr. Steve Lipner invite-only meeting that comes up with these fake consensus, to the trustworthy computing memo, where Bill Gates writes that every week there are reports of newly discovered security problems in all kinds of softwares, from individual applications and services in Windows and Linux and Unix and other platforms. We can and must do better. This is the Bill Gates famous memo. He promised that a new design approach would need to dramatically reduce the number of such issues that come up in the software that Microsoft and its partners create. We need to make it automatic for customers to get a benefit of these fixes, and eventually our software should be so fundamentally secure that customers never worry about it. This is 2000. I want to go back and read this one. Every week, there are reports of newly discovered security problems in all kinds of software. This is 2002. This is the year 2000. If I put the year 2022 on the top right of this screen here, you would know, right? At the time, Bill Gates promised that the software should be so fundamentally secure that customers never even worry about it. Tie this to researchers are irresponsible. Everything bad about Microsoft is because there are irresponsible researchers telling you about it. We are over here fixing it. And here is where I want to pause, get off of my fuck Microsoft hat, and say, congratulations to Microsoft for really driving a lot of really solid technical innovation that has made desktop computing, server computing, and all of these things really strong and in a place where we can rely on it today. The Trustworthy Computing memo gave us XP Service Pack 2 that addressed Windows worms. It came with a firewall. It was the first time the desktop operating system had a firewall turned on by default. Really put a crimp in Windows worms and moved and made desktop computing something that we could actually use and rely on. Props to Microsoft for that. We ended up with ASLR and DEP and memory corruption mitigations and roadblocks. A lot of solid innovation there that moved the needle, removed a whole bunch of script kiddies who were wreaking havoc on the operating system and made it much more difficult to exploit these operating systems. and not a huge part of the trustworthy computing memo. Today, we take it for granted, automatic updates. Every software comes with automatic updates. The browsers patch themselves. Back then, you had to manually patch your machine. Automatic updates, and it was turned on by default in XP Service Pack 2 into Windows Vista and some of the other memory mitigations things there. And on the policy side of things, we got this SDLC, Secure Development Lifecycle and Threat Modeling. Today, you kids call it shift left and whatever, DevOps, blah, blah, you call it today. But back then, it was threat modeling and SDLC that was introduced by Microsoft and really, really took hold. We got a bunch of pre-patch security advisories. We got Patch Tuesday. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, commiserations to you who have to deal with Patch Tuesday. But we got a reliable monthly cadence when we could expect patches. Microsoft led the way with this. Today, Patch Tuesday is a normal thing. It's an accepted part of the industry. It's actually helping people to prepare for deployment of patches. And all other companies have copied Microsoft and done the same thing. We've got some other programs like the Microsoft Active Protections Program, MAP, that provides early notice of and telemetry for security vendors to react. So, in fairness, from 2000, despite the shenanigans around responsive disclosure, in fairness, Microsoft over the years spent a lot of time doing really, really solid innovation and got us to a place where the trustworthy computing memo, I would say by the year 2005, 2006, 2007, had delivered on its promise, for the most part, had delivered on its promise. But it took a lot of fighting. It took a lot of folks, and a lot of folks in this room, to really hold Microsoft accountable over those years. And even from 2000, we got the responsible disclosure, we had all these fights. All the way to 2005, 2006, 2007, the whole notion of vendors bashing researchers and vendors bashing hackers for disclosure issues continued to be a big problem. In chapter 4, I want to move to MS-05-009. Anyone recognize this bug? One person in the room. Two people in the room, of course, recognize. You got a guy in the corner there waving. MS-05-009 was the first time I had ever seen a remote zero-click exploit that popped a machine without a user doing anything whatsoever. And to set the stage for telling this story, I got to tell you what desktop communications looked like at the time. People who use AOL Messenger, she's one of us. So freaking old. AOL and MSN Messenger were two desktop IM applications at the time that we all needed. I was writing stories about interoperability, the lack of interoperability. You needed AOL and you needed IM, and we were always fighting for them to start talking to each other. This is long before you kids had your TikTokies and Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and all these communication platforms. Back then, you needed AOL, IM on your desktop, and you needed an MSN. MSN was the cool one because MSN gave you a buddy list. You could set cool away messages. You could set profile pictures. Like, profile pictures was a big thing at the time. We were just so freaking excited we could change profile pictures by the week. Like, this is what all people did back then. Sometime around, I don't know the dates because no one knows the dates, but sometime around 2004, I want to say 2003, and just because I know the shit that happened at Microsoft at the time, it might have been 2002. Core Security, a small company located right here in Argentina, reported a vulnerability in PNG processing that could allow remote code execution. I say 2003, 2004, it might have been reported then because nobody knows, nobody was documenting things. And this was a very, very bad bug. Microsoft patched it in February 08, 2005. I was at my desk in a building in New York City when an exploit landed on Maintrack. It was the day that Microsoft patched this. It might have been February 8, 2005. And an exploit, Core Security released an exploit code for this PNG processing vulnerability. It was really, really, really bad. Let me go back for a second. It was really, really bad. Right? I mentioned MSN Messenger had this profile picture thing. This bug was so bad that the attacker could manipulate his body list. Correct me if I'm wrong, for the folks who know it. Attacker could manipulate the image in his body list and compromise your list, and then turn it into a worm to compromise folks throughout the system. It was one of those really, really, really zero-click bugs. And when I say it was the first time I'd ever seen one, it literally, like, my body list was here, and then calc was popping. And there was no clicking, there was no nothing. And the guys were showing me this exploit, right? It was really, really, really bad. When Microsoft patched it, again, going back to the period, the patch would be issued, vendors would test, and people would eventually get around to patching it. But over that time, people were reversing those patches very, very quickly. Attackers were reversing those patches very, very quickly, much like today, and getting their own exploits. So Core, because it was so bad, Core decided, listen guys, this is really, really bad. We're going to put out a proof of concept exploit just to prove it. Microsoft was pissed. I got a call from Steptoe, RIP, the great Stephen Toulouse from Microsoft at the time, saying, Ryan, are you going to write about these Core guys? Are you going to write about this nonsense of these Core guys? These guys literally released an exploit for something that could cause debilitating damage across the industry. And I said to Steptoe, guys, these guys reported this bug to you. These guys gave this to you. You had time to fix it. You have to fix it. You fixed it. Why are you still fighting with these guys? Is there a possibility that we could push this as a mandatory update? I remember having this conversation with him. Why isn't this a mandatory update? If it's so bad and you guys... Turns out Microsoft, a week later, released, made an operational switch to MSN Messenger that made the fix mandatory. You could not log into MSN Messenger anymore unless you had applied the patch. But again, using the vessel of me as a security researcher, Microsoft calls and starts yelling, lashing out to two companies. I believe FinGen Software at the time was related to something else that had published proof of concept code. But Core and my friend Max Casares took a lot of heat for releasing the exploit and pushing this thing forward. And at the time I wrote about this, and I was like, you know, struggling between how bad is it, we need to get it fixed, and here we are with Microsoft pinning the blame for exploit code squarely on the shoulders of Core security. The publishing of proof of concept code within hours of the security updates being made has put customers at increased risk, right? They created a special MSN Messenger page. There was like a whole thing. It was like a whole process. What I didn't know, what the rest of the industry didn't know, was that Core had reported the bug to Microsoft for a long time. They knew how bad it was. They sat on it, and the fix took several months. Like, this is, again, we find out later on how bad the bug was. It literally was the first, before Natashenko and all these folks are doing zero-click stuff, these guys were doing this stuff back in 2005. Right? So for months and months, they had sat on it. Core had said, hey, you guys are going to fix it. They had been pushed off again. Hey, you guys are going to fix it. They've been pushed off again. Then the fix finally comes. Core ships the exploit. Core gets blamed. And I realized, wait a second, this isn't right. This isn't right. And I commend Core for releasing that exploit. I commend Core for pushing the needle forward and holding them accountable in ways that really set the stage for everything we've seen later on. And the tail end to this chapter is, because of what happened with Microsoft and because of all that nonsense, Core decided that they were going to be the masters of the timeline. They were going to document from the time they reported the bug to the time the patch was shipped and they shipped their exploits, this massive page. It used to be this one page of like inches and inches and pages of documentation. We reported the bug to Microsoft. Microsoft accepted. Microsoft does not release this is a fix. We believe it's a fix. We send them exploit code. They couldn't get the exploit code to work. We send them a tool to help them get the exploit code to work. We send, and there's disclosure, and these are some examples of some of the funnier ones. Whoever's responsible for the advisories page at Core today, please get it fixed. You've ruined what has been beautiful historical part of cybersecurity where we could find these for the first time, Core gave us an eyeball into what was happening all those years when you report the bug, and you wait for a fix, and you wait for a fix, and they said, we'll fix it eventually. So I want to pay tribute to the folks from Core. If anyone recognized themselves in this picture, please stand. Stand, I said. We have one guy here. And I put this picture up here because let me tell you something. These guys were way, way, way ahead of their time. These guys back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, they were building things that we take for granted today. They were building the first attack surface management tools. Today, there are hundreds of millions of dollars in Israeli companies invested into attack surface management and red teaming and penetration testing. These guys right in this room, and these guys in an office 10 minutes from here, 15 minutes from here in Palermo, was building the roots of penetration testing. They were holding Microsoft accountable. They did it with great bravery. They did it at great cost. Microsoft would eventually nudge Core out of all those contracts that went to IOActive and Leviathan and all those US companies, and they did it at great bravery and at great cost. So I want, again, a round of applause for the folks at Core Security. For holding the fort and pushing us forward. Famous Core Security shirt as well. We're always there for you. The top 10 reasons Microsoft is not like your ex. Another quick story I'll run through here is this 2-year-old kernel bug, the emergency MS017 patch. Anyone recognize this one? Nobody here recognize? Yep, 1, 2. Who is this guy? This guy knows everything. We got to talk afterwards. I talked about what disclosure looked like in 2000, and now we're all the way to 2006. 6 years after Bill Gates' memo, 6 years later, we're still fighting. We're still fighting about vulnerabilities and Microsoft and vendors' approach to fixing things. So we move forward to 2006, and this was a big part of my life and reporting over the years was the month of bugs. Every month, every day for an entire month, for 30 days, guys would release exploit code and proof of concepts targeting specific things. So in July 2006, HD Moore launched Month of Browser Bugs. It was a lot of proof of concept code for flaws in IE, Firefox, Safari, Opera, Conqueror. Chrome didn't exist at the time. But when I say proof of concept code and releases, every single one of these were things that had been reported to the vendor, had been ignored, and pushed back. So these guys were just like, listen, I got all these bugs and proof of concept sitting around. I'm just going to throw them up 30 days. We'll get some headlines. And I'm the security journalist, and I'm like, fuck yeah, we get stories to write. Let's go. So I was covering these things on a daily basis. HD Moore did the month of browser bugs in July. November, LMH and some guys did, I think Kevin Finisterre was involved with this one. The month of kernel bugs. December, we saw the month of Apple bugs. March, it became month of PHP bugs, and by late 2007, it started to fizzle out. We had month of Twitter bugs, and month of Facebook bugs, and all of that. But the one I want to focus on is the month of kernel bugs. The month of kernel bugs in November 2006 gave us MOKB 0611-2006, a Windows kernel GDI local privilege escalation bug. You see the note at the bottom? This was reported to Microsoft on October 22, 2004. Vulnerability in handling GDI kernel structures that leads to an exploitable memory corruption condition causing DOS or arbitrary code execution on successful components. Again, the guy on the right here, Cesar Cerudo, an Argentinian hacker who you should all know, had reported this to Microsoft in October 2004, and the response was, meh. The response was, we'll fix that in a service pack. The response was, stop bothering us with this bug. Real story. So in 2004, he reports it. He keeps checking with Microsoft, and the usual happens. We'll fix it eventually. It's not a thing. There's no code execution risk. It's a small DOS thing. We'll fix it in a service pack. So 2006 comes along. Month of kernel bugs is happening, and Cesar says, hey, I got one here. These guys aren't going to fix it. Hey, let me throw it over the wall. So he throws it over the wall, and the guys published the proof of concept as part of this month of kernel bugs. It was a small, tiny thing. It was one of 30 bugs. It was like a small, tiny thing. Fast forward a few months, we get to Black Hat Europe in Amsterdam, and there's a bunch of European hackers who took this month of browser bugs thing, found by Cesar Cerudo. Joel Eriksson was the guy as well, who took that Windows 2000 XP bug that Cesar had reported in 2004. They were going to eventually fix in a storage pack, at least that was the promise. And he turned it into an actual remote code execution exploit, fitted it into, I believe it was Immunity. I believe it was Immunity Canvas. It was sold into Immunity Canvas. And then suddenly, this 2004 GDI bug that Cesar reported is now in a functional exploit pack used by, it was supposedly used for a lot of pen testing and red teaming exercise. But now it's in the hands of, the places that those guys sold stuff to. But the story doesn't end here with that exploit. We fast forward, 2 years later, Microsoft drops an emergency patch, MSO 7017. It's super critical, April 3rd, 2007. And I was like, wait a second. This is Cesar's bug. This doesn't make any sense at all. Like, why is this a freaking emergency patch? There was an animated cursor issue at the time that was causing some havoc. But what they did, because Cesar put it into mount of browser bugs, and because Joel fitted it into an exploit platform, MSO 7017 fixes Cesar's bug in a very, very critical allow remote code execution emergency out-of-band update in April 3, 2007. So I called Microsoft. I was like, what the fuck? Like, why is it, how is this an emergency patch when you were just telling me during the month of kernel bugs, I had written about it and I had said, this was reported a long time ago, la, la, la. Why is this an emergency fix? And it's like, well, Cesar was irresponsible. True story. So I wrote this story, and I share this because if anyone asks me what was your favorite story to write over the years, it was this one, because it was really, really a microcosm of what things looked like at the time. You would get a bug, the vendor would just do whatever they wanted, and then paint the researcher with the responsible disclosure bug. So I wrote this story. It gave me some of my most famous quotes. We don't credit researchers who participate in full disclosure, Millis declared, chalking up that stance to a rigid policy to encourage the concept of responsible disclosure. Keep in mind, again, this is a bug that was given to them in 2004. 2 years later, they're accusing this guy of irresponsible disclosure because they didn't patch it on time. It was unacceptable, and my favorite quote was Andrew Cushman, who I'm sure a lot of you know. He says, I hope you don't write that we were twiddling our thumbs doing nothing for 2 years. And I was so happy he gave me that quote, because he gave me a chance to write exactly that they were twiddling their thumbs and they wouldn't do anything until there was risk. And that brings me to the point of these vendors are only going to be held accountable until you hold them to the fire. Fast forward quickly to the point to own, and when bug bounties became the actual bug. Bug bounties became hush money and warped financial incentives. I talk about holding people to the fire, holding Microsoft to the fire, full disclosure, and the ability to go to the public and say, hey, I gave this to Microsoft 2 years ago and they're not going to fix it, was what gave us that emergency fix. That was one example of thousands that was happening at the time. These stories I'm telling you, these are not big, big, big stories. These are just tiny little stories that I was a part of. But this is what it looked like all the way at the time. How many people have seen this photo before from CanSec West in 2010? This is 10 years after 10 years after the Scott Culp, SafeNet 2000, Trustworthy Computing Memo. Dino Daizovi and Alex Sotirov gets on the stage at CanSec West. Charlie Miller is on the microphone saying, it's enough, guys. These guys are treating us like shit. We're giving them free bugs. We're giving them free QA. We're reporting all these vulnerabilities to them. No more free bugs. Stop. Stop reporting bugs to vendors. Make sure they pay you. If you don't get paid and we are not compensated, we're not going to play. Again, big story for me I wrote at the time. Researchers are fighting back, blah, 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 blah. Dave Goldsmith from Matasano at the time pulled me in a corner at RSA the same year and said, be careful what you wish for. Be careful what you wish for with this no more free bugs bullshit, because what will happen is the vendors, the power that you have will eventually shift to vendors. And I remember looking at Dave Goldsmith and saying, and he used to say, you know, these bugs are not free. There already are no free bugs. It costs these vendors a lot to deal with it and so on. And I tell you, Dave Goldsmith was right. What that push for vendors to start paying and start compensating researchers created a startup ecosystem and an entire ecosystem of hush money, bribery, venture capital startups abusing security researchers. On the screen right now, you're looking at 3 unprofitable late-stage Series D, Series E startups that have raised $159 million, $78 million, and $107 million. I don't know if you know how VC works, but VC and the drive in the business world requires growth. Everything needs to be growth. If HackerOne is not growing, they're losing. And what the no more free bugs, pawn to own, pay researchers created this ecosystem where it's not all bad. How many people here play bug bounties and make a lot of money from bug bounties? Shout out to you guys. It's not all bad. Bug bounties have created earning power and essential earning power for a lot of people all over the world, in India, in China, and all the parts of the world. But the downside and the dark pattern here is that it's removed the power from the research community. It's removed that kind of hold to the fire. It's gotten us to a place where these are starting to bubble up, where security researchers are starting to rant about how these programs are set up to abuse researchers. These programs are set up for vendors to get the upper hand and spend money to keep you quiet. Bugs that are reported in 2004 that gets fixed in 2006 and vendors are fighting about, this exists today, except that no one is there to fight it. And the Cesar Cerrutos and the core security have all been consumed in this bug bounty world because they need to earn and they need to get paid. And we have no way to do the necessary fight back. So to close out, I want to talk a little bit about some of these dark patterns that keep emerging every year. The vendor that I talked about, that was my beat, is now a $15 billion cybersecurity vendor. You know what that means? That next year they need to be a $16 billion cybersecurity vendor. You know what that means? That the following year they need to be a $17 billion cybersecurity vendor, because the minute Satya Nadella decided to break out cybersecurity revenues, he made it clear that cybersecurity is very, very big business. We are here to squeeze every dollar out of it. The stock market will rely on us growing year over year. And when these kinds of incentives have shifted in so much where Microsoft needs to grow, security gets hit, and security takes a backseat, and security starts to suffer. I'll use one small example here, and this is a small one. Microsoft.com WAC security. Microsoft.com/security for many, many years, all these years, used to look like this. This is an old screenshot. It's been adopted over the years. But it literally was, Microsoft.com/security was a place you could go to find information on where you can apply the patch. IT pros got infrastructure threat modeling guide. It literally was a portal for you to go find security response, real, genuine information. I'm not going to show you what it looks like today. I'm going to encourage you guys to go to MicrosoftSecurity.com today. When you go there today, there is no information whatsoever on security research vulnerabilities. There's no information whatsoever on response. Instead, you get 3 buttons: Home, Business, and Enterprise. And when you click on either of those buttons, they ask you for your credit card. This is what Microsoft.com/security looks like today. It's now a page to sell their software and to become a $15 billion a year vendor in a world run by bounties where we have no way of doing this fight back. So this is a dark pattern that I think you should really, really pay attention to. And if you work at Microsoft, I just beg you, can we get back a little section of Microsoft.com/security just so we can get some actual information and not you trying to sell us something. You cannot be if you are a $15 billion a year vendor that needs to be a $17 billion a year vendor in 2 years, you have a higher level of responsibility to your users. And you cannot be claiming to be a cybersecurity leader, and you cannot claim to be in control of things when these are the dominant headlines of the day. The screenshots on your screen is a Wikipedia page for Print Nightmare, an issue that Microsoft struggles to patch. They've tried to patch it. They keep botching the patches. They botch patches on Microsoft Exchange Server. We're left in a world where everything is duct taped and ball waxed into complexity and legacy code left over. We're producing and pushing out more code than we can realistically secure. We're in 2022, and the security vendors who are 2 minutes, yeah. I see the timer here. I got the 2 minutes. Don't make me panic. We have a $15 billion a year vendor who's struggling to patch their software, dealing with a zero-day epidemic, and driving us to just keep buying their software. I took this screenshot, October 2022. I want you to read it carefully and tell me if this doesn't read exactly like the ones I showed you from 2000. Microsoft just had a misconfigured Microsoft storage location issue, and the SOC Radar company that reported it published some stuff. They made some mistakes, yes, here and there. But the language from Microsoft really, really irks me. God. You okay, bro?
Keep going, man. You're good.
Dude, that's a fucking bad fall. You good?
Very good. Keep going.
Sorry, guys. The point I want to make is that in 2022, the languages are exactly the same. Microsoft is beating up and pushing and vilifying the people who are actually reporting the things to them. 2022, this is a LinkedIn post from Tenable CEO Amit Yoran. Again, a lot of the things that we see today are the same things that are reported in 2022. It's starting to feel very, very much like 2001 all over again. It's starting to feel very much like when we were inundated with worm attacks and things felt unbearable. The same things for CISOs today. They're inundated with ransomware attacks and supply chain issues and all kinds of things that feels unbearable. Like I just showed you, responsible disclosure is still a nightmare, and it's a nightmare only for researchers. We're in a world where in the wild OD attacks are escalating. I don't know if you guys have looked, but last year we had 84 documented in the wild attacks. Those are the ones that we know about. It's probably 1,000 that we don't know about. But the ones that we know about, there were 84 last year, and I think we're up to 40 this year of actual vulnerabilities that have been exploited in the wild before the vendor has even gotten a chance to even see it or create a patch. We are inundated with supply chain compromises, vendors fighting with researchers. Have you ever tried to look at one of Microsoft's bulletins today? Where in the past we used to hear this, it's now a blank screen. It literally is, there's a bug, these things are affected, fix it. Nobody knows what's across. It's just a complete and utter nightmare. We've gone backwards. Microsoft has given up all those gains, and here we are in 2022, and I'm writing the same freaking stories all over again. I want to make one last point. The stakes are very, very high. The power rests with us to fix it. It's a very, very hard problem to fix. The bug bounties and the bug bounty markets have really screwed things up. There's room for innovation. There's room for, like I said, innovate or die. There's room for us to fix this. It starts here in this room. It starts with the next generation of folks, the gray bears.